Well, welcome to KT Soundbites. My name is Audrey Perez. I am a partner in Kilpatrick Townsend's Government Enforcement and Investigations practice. And with me today is Greg Freemeyer from Sullivan Strickler. I'm excited that the two of us are talking today about collecting and preserving information from smart devices when conducting internal corporate investigations and responding to government inquiries. Greg and I have worked a lot together in the past year, given the U.S. government's focus on collecting information from employee devices. I think it's common knowledge these days that the government and a lot of us believe that there's more interesting information on an employee's device than in corporate email. And for that reason, the U.S. government has put out guidance over the last several years explaining to companies how they need to have controls in place to preserve that information in order to not only follow the company's document retention policies, but to also comply with their legal obligations. Now, today, Greg and I are not going to be talking about what policies you need or consents in order to comply with the various data protection and privacy considerations around the world. Really, we're going to be focusing on the nuts and bolts of collection and giving some practice tips and war stories about what we've seen has worked and may not work so well. So with that, Greg, what does Sullivan Strickler need in order to make sure that a collection is successful?
The biggest thing is cooperation. It's awful hard to do these collections if you don't have cooperation from the custodians. We typically go through a quick Q&A process. We want to make sure we know what the data sources are. Are they using their laptops? Are they using Gmail out there in the cloud? What are they doing? There's cloud accounts, there's physical devices, there's chat applications. You have to have a summary of what all is in play before you start collecting. And too often, I think lawyers want to reach up and say, go to get John Doe's data and tell us what you have once you have it. Like, that's a little difficult. We need to really have a interview before we start where we put a universe in place of what is relevant, what isn't relevant, and what are the dates and timeframes, and what is the critical information to gather.
And I know, Greg, you get this question as often as I do, which is, how long is it going to take to collect from a phone or a tablet?
And it's all over the map. Really, nowadays, it seems to be impacted drastically by the amount of videos and photographs on the devices. I've seen one device I did about a year ago. It took 24 hours to load in, just transferring data the entire 24 hours. We have others that go as quick as 15 minutes, but typically we're in the 4 to 6 hours for a single phone or a single tablet.
And I know during the pandemic, you and your team helped me a lot in collecting. And of course, we had some limitations where, given lockdowns and whatnot, we weren't able to physically obtain the device. So what do you do in those situations?
We have developed a few different solutions for that. We have solutions now where we can do it via backups. So some of the manufacturers have backup tools in the cloud. We have a write-up that we can send out to the custodian, have them back up their device, which pushes it all to the cloud. We can then pull that down. Sometimes there's also synchronization services. Some of these applications synchronize their data with the cloud. It's not in the backup, it's in a synchronization archive. So we can pull that down. And then sometimes we send out physical hardware and walk a custodian through connecting it to their device and directly pulling it down. There's different amounts of data available with the different approaches.
And then the kind of information you're able to collect, I'm always surprised because it's a whole breadth of information. But what typically do you see after collecting?
Well, text messages are certainly something that almost every lawyer wants to see. But I've been surprised. Sometimes we find even documents. I saw a zip file on a custodian's cell phone recently. And I'm like, how in the world does a zip file with 20 or 30 confidential documents inside it end up on a cell phone? That did not happen via text message. That's somebody connecting their phone to a laptop and purposefully placing that zip file on there. And so it's just very interesting when you find something like that. That was a very interesting case.
I'm glad you mentioned text messages because obviously that's at the top of our list of items we like to review, whether it's SMS, MMS, or via an application. Also, texting applications have improved over time to where they give us even more information than just text. There are audio files. There are also money transfer information. So that can be helpful in our white collar internal investigations. On top of that, notes, call logs, contacts, and also geographical location. And I know that Sullivan Strickler has some interesting tools to help with that. In one matter I had involving the False Claims Act, one of our clients had a contract with US government authorities where they had to be at government site a certain amount of time on certain days with a certain frequency. And we needed to look at the geographical location information on employee devices to make sure that we were abiding by those obligations. So I'd say those are probably the top sources of information we like to see when collecting. Do you have any other thoughts on other types of source information on phones or tablets?
Well, I just wanted to mention with the geographic, people don't know where that comes from. So it's sort of interesting. First of all, most cell phones have a latitude longitude tracker. That's how they can do the mapping. It can tell you how to drive your car or whatever. That's because it knows where it's at. So when it has that ability, it's very common when you take a photograph with your phone that it embeds the current latitude and longitude or location into the photograph. So one of the ways we figure out where the phone was is we look at all the photographs and pull latitude and longitude information out. But also when you're connecting to cell towers and or Wi-Fi networks, there are databases that tell you where those cell towers and Wi-Fi networks are. So if we have a history of what cell towers were used on a given day or what Wi-Fi networks, and that's pretty precise down to the minute. We can tell when you connected to a certain tower or to a certain Wi-Fi. You can use that to build up your geographic information. So quite often we can get a very interesting flow at a high level anyway of where people were. And then you can add in your health data. You didn't talk about health data, and it may not relate to the white collar crime stuff you worked on, but I've seen it in accident investigations. Let's say you have a construction accident. You want to know what was the person doing just before they fell off the building. That's an important question. And so with the health data, you can see they were running, or they were walking, or they just came up 5 flights of stairs, or they made the 200-yard walk over to the security building where they got their briefing. So there's a lot of information that can come from that health information. And that's one of the more intriguing sources for me to look at.
And have you, Greg, at all, have you collected information like health data from Fitbits or smart watches or anything to that effect? Or would it be the same process that you would use for other smart devices?
It's the same. The smart devices like the phones, it's interesting. Most of them don't actually have a whole lot of internal storage. They transfer everything to their paired phone. So normally your Fitbits and your smartwatches are not individual independent devices. They need a smartphone to go with them. And it's the smartphone where you gather most of the data.
And then one quick question, which I know seems very basic, but what is the difference between SMS and MMS? I get this question a lot from our clients.
So SMS is pure text. Now it's
Mhm.
been out there forever. I shouldn't say that, but since the mid 90s, you've been able to send text messages between phones, and it's a very native basic protocol. And again, there's no attachment to it. There's no photo, there's no audio, there's no video. It's just the text itself. If you have, oh, it's also not a group message. It's just one to one. If you have a more sophisticated text message with an attachment or a group of people that you're in party to, you have to step up to the MMS protocol. It's not a significant difference. I do not like it when tools don't integrate those two. We want our SMS and MMS messages integrated. There's also other applications that we can see that are in text messaging or chat messaging. We want all that integrated together because some of these cell phones move from one protocol to another based on what they're hooked up to. If you have a 3G connection to the cell network, then it's going to use maybe SMS and MMS because that's available in the older generation towers. But if your phone is now connected to a 4G or a 5G network, it may switch to a different communications protocol. It's still one conversation. You don't want to have that broken apart just because it's using different technology. And I'm happy to say most of these review tools now integrate that into one process, one conversation.
Right now, I'll say over time, I've seen significant improvement in just the type of information, but also how it's formatted when we do our reviews. So, for example, I remember doing an investigation in India years ago where I could only see the one message at a time. So if I texted you, Greg, and said, "Good morning," I could see that. And then I'd have to actually click through to see your response. Now it's a little bit easier, and I actually can see the attached gifs or photos. So we've come a long way from that. But there's still instances where technology isn't perfect, and we've all experienced that during the pandemic. And so, what sort of challenges or instances have you seen where maybe we didn't get exactly what we wanted?
Oh, well, lots of them, but certainly in say 2018 and before, each message in a conversation was really treated uniquely, and we didn't have a great way to form conversations. But in 2019, 2020, the whole industry has moved to where it's conversation based. If you and I have known each other for a long time and we're sending text messages back and forth, we can put together either daily or monthly conversation views. It's great when we can do that with bubbles, especially if it's left and right justified. Different tools can do different things, but we love it when we can have that conversation look as much like the phone as possible. And that's actually a requirement, as you know, as a lawyer, of what you're supposed to produce. You're supposed to produce it in a format as similar as possible as it was experienced by the user. So if you've got a review tool that's got everything left justified, that's not the way it is on the phone. If it's in a spreadsheet, it's definitely not the way it is on the phone. And so we're actually meeting the requirements of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure to start producing things the way they look like on the phone.
Yeah, and that's so important when we're doing our international internal investigations and even domestically, because if I can't show a spreadsheet to a witness and say, okay, tell me what happened with this, with these text messages, it just they need to see it like they see it on the phone for it to be a very meaningful interview. But with that said, though, Greg, you and I had an instance recently where we had taken information off of an employee's device, and we weren't able to tell who the participants on some of these texting exchanges were. And it was like code breaking during World War II. Like we had to look at who used what emojis and what kind of slang did they use and how did they refer to each other to figure out who the participants were, because the way that the software that collected it wasn't working as well with that texting application. And it all turned out great. We were able to get exactly what we needed for the investigation. But again, sometimes technology is not perfect, and you just have to figure out a way to work with it.
Yeah, that's definitely true. That particular one, the phone was not available physically, so we
Mhm.
used a because of the COVID situation. So we used a backup of what was on the phone. The conversion from a backup into a review site didn't go as smooth as we would like, and some information was lost. And so we ended up with exactly what you're saying, a lot of messages where we didn't have the participant as known people. Fortunately, we were able to put it together and figure it all out. And a lot of that ended up right in your team's lap. So you had to do a lot of the hard work on that.
But it all worked out, which is great. Another question I get from clients frequently is, well, I've heard that some of these applications that messages disappear or are deleted and cannot be revealed forensically. I mean, what's your answer to that?
It's actually pretty true. I've seen a lot of things disappear. We have found recently, over the last year or so, that people are using more cloud based archiving services or repositories for synchronizing their devices. If they have a phone and a tablet and they want to keep the data synchronized between the two, they have to go through the cloud typically to do that. We're now able to pull that down out of the cloud in some situations. And I've seen situations where on the phone, it only went back 90 days or 60 days, and they're like, "That's all I've got." And then we go get that archive and say, "Oh, this goes back to 2014," and suddenly we're in great shape. I had a situation about 14, 15 months ago where a custodian admitted under deposition that someone had advised him the smart thing to do before he went into deposition was delete all his personal text messages off the phone. So he shows up and he had deleted like 20,000 text messages over the previous 2 days. And we went in and did a very detailed analysis. As you can imagine, the spoliation concerns were just astronomical. And this was a very high value situation. So we really spent a lot of time analyze it. We pulled up everything off the phone. He did have that archive that I just mentioned established, or that synchronization repository. We pulled that down and we did a comparison. And I found that 95% of what he deleted in the few days before the deposition, we were not able to recover from the phone. I was very surprised. Prior to that, I was of the impression that we were getting a significant amount of the data off the phone, even after deletion. But since I went through that very specific and detailed analysis, I'm like, nope, we're getting almost 5-10% is typical of what we're getting off a phone if it's deleted.
Well, I do want to spend some time, Greg, on talking about some tips that I have learned over time about what to really focus on when collecting from devices and what's really helpful. So one thing that your team does, Greg, that I always appreciate is after collection, they provide us an Excel spreadsheet that lists tabs at the bottom of all the various sources of information, whether it's SMS, or maybe it's a notes application or contacts. And so I can easily see very quickly the types of sources, but I also get little snippets of those text messages, or maybe even the notes themselves in the notes application, so that I can see, okay, who is this person talking to? What kind of lingo are they using? And so we can very quickly determine what information sources we really need to review, and whether that's 5 different sources or 10 out of the 50. And then what search terms can we go ahead and apply initially that really are going to give us the biggest bang for our buck, right? That are going to be very targeted so we can get to the meat of what we actually need. And so that Excel spreadsheet really starts us off on a great path for the investigation. I always appreciate how your team does that. The second tip I wanted to make sure people understand, and I know you've said this to my team many times, is that the timestamps are not exactly the time zone that the person may be in. It actually may be UTC time, which can be very significant for us when we're trying to figure out who did what when. So to keep in mind that those timestamps could be UTC. Do you have any thoughts on that, Greg?
That's very important. And one reason that's relevant too is, let's say, even if I give it to you in Eastern time, if that person happened to have been in Europe or they were in the West Coast, the time is just, it's an arbitrary time. The phone itself tracks everything in UTC, which is time over in Greenwich, England. That's how the phone works. When we tell you that this is now in Eastern time or it's in Pacific time, we've done a conversion. We've made an assumption that that custodian was in a certain location. And if they're always in Atlanta, Georgia, yeah, you're great. But if they're traveling, it's really not that helpful to only have time zones that are Eastern time. It's best to go with UTC and then convert it to what you know they were at that given day. So if you know they were in LA, Los Angeles, you can go ahead and adjust it to Pacific time. If you know they're in London, you can move it that way. So it's just great to start with UTC and then adjust it as needed for the presentation.
Yeah, that's a great tip because you really can't assume that. And so it's a very good tip. The other thing I want people to keep in mind too is when we review these text messages in our review tool, we only get 24 hours with that same group. So, for example, if I'm texting with you, Greg, for 24 hours, but then we bring in our friend Jennifer into the conversation, that is going to be a separate review file. And so it's something that my team is always thinking about is, okay, when we're looking at this one text message, this is just 24 hours. It's a snapshot in time between these 2 or 3 people, but there is potential that there could be other text messages that same day with additional participants or less participants. And so it's really key to have that context and really understand that we're just looking at snapshots. And if you want the bigger picture, you're going to have to dig a little deeper.
Absolutely. And we could call that a feature request for any of the software vendors out there listening to us. So what you're talking about is you and I, for instance, start a conversation and we go back and forth for a couple hours. Oh, we do have a question for Susan. And we add Susan to the conversation thread. Well, all the technology says that's a brand new thread. That's a new conversation for the day. And there's no linkage at all to that. So how can that be linked? Can we have a similar button or some other way to click on a button to pull in and give us options of what else might be relevant for that conversation? Right now, I'm not aware of any tool that gives us that flexibility to move between a aspect of the conversation as it grows and participants are added to the thread. And I know what happens. I use a corporate communication tool for chatting, and we do it all the time. I'm always adding people or removing people from those conversations through the course of the day. So if you're tied to just one set of participants, you're going to miss half the conversation.
And any other thoughts on device collection, Greg, or tips to keep in mind?
No, we've hit the biggies, but it's important to realize you can do the physical. And there's sometimes that's really the very best because we can get more information off of physical. For instance, health data, walking is often only available if you have the physical device. It's not in the backup because they don't consider it relevant. So that's our primary or best choice. Then we can go to backups. Even when you can do the physical, the synchronization repositories are supplemental. That's could be much more additional information that's in the synchronization repository that's just simply not on the device and not in the backup. So people that think they're getting the gold standard when they get the device, they're not. They need to get at least the two different sources, which is the device and any synchronization repositories associated with the device.
And I do want to talk briefly, Greg, about legacy email, because I know that is an area of expertise for Sullivan Strickler. I am starting to deal with that even more these days because my clients will receive a government inquiry or a subpoena where the period of time just happens to be when the client transitioned from their legacy email system to the cloud. And that can be a very expensive task to try to collect that information and respond to a subpoena. And so how does Sullivan Strickler deal with those types of tasks when trying to get legacy email?
So we actually have an entire team dedicated to that as one of the core competencies of our company. And it can be older tape-based archiving systems for email. It can be newer systems such as Veeam, some people have heard of, but there's a lot of different archiving systems. We have specialists that have that full set of skill sets, but it is a challenge and it can be expensive. But we can work with it, trying to make it as cost effective as possible. One thing a lot of people don't realize, let's say that there's 365 backups for the course of a year. Often, if you look at just the monthly backup, you'll get 100% coverage of what the data is. But you need somebody who's an expert to help write an affidavit to explain to the court, this is why we only have to look at the monthly data. It's because it is comprehensive. The way their system is set up is that when an email is deleted, it's maintained in the backup system. I'm sorry, maintained in the main system until a full backup is made. But by working with us, we can then put together those statements that can be taken to the court to justify why you only need to look at 12 backups for the course of a year and not 365. So now you've seen a 30-to-1 drop in cost or expense. So it's something we definitely can work with and help clients come up with the most cost-effective way to get there.
And I'm glad you mentioned affidavits to the court because in my line of work, it is very helpful to have someone from Sullivan Strickler to be on the phone with me with the DOJ or SEC to say, look, this is what you're asking for, costs this amount, but can we come up with a solution that may be more cost effective, but also more targeted? Do we really need to provide all of this when really for your investigation government, you just need a small subset? So I think using you and your team and your colleagues, Greg, to sort of come up with a middle ground is really critical, given your expertise.
Yeah, I would say that at Sullivan Strickler, one thing we're very good at is working with clients and trying to be cost effective. If certainly we're happy to have you spend $1 million with us, but often it's far, far, far less than that. So we're trying to be cost effective and get the lawyer to where he needs to be. As you may know, Rule 1 of Federal Rules of Civil Procedure is to have your expenses be cost effective. You don't want to just have unbelievable expense associated with your litigation.
No, nobody wants that, especially on the white collar side too. We definitely don't. Well, I really appreciate all your time, Greg. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I love how you're quoting me rules of civil procedure. I appreciate that.
Most lawyers don't know that rule number 1.
Well, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.